3 murders that could have been avoided. "That's what I call it," said the mastermind. "Absolutely perfect. You'll see." Suddenly, Errol Parker began to rub his throat. He coughed repeatedly. Then he gasped loudly. "Ah! Ah!" His throat and his chest were burning. He couldn't breathe. "What is it? What's wrong, Errol?" "Errol!" Brienne asked, alarmed and afraid. Then she grabbed at her throat too. It was on fire. So was her chest. She dropped the glass of wine and held her throat with both hands. The tenement room seemed to be whirling out of control. Errol spasmed, then fell to the floor and had a seizure. Brienne bit a gash into her tongue. Both of them were still clutching at their throats. They were choking, gagging, unable to breathe. The mastermind stood across the room and watched. The paralysis from the poison they had imbibed was progressive and extremely painful. It started with the facial muscles, then moved to the glottis in the back of the throat. The Parkers obviously couldn't swallow. Finally, it affected the respiratory organs. A high enough dose of anectine led to cardiac arrest. It took less than 15 minutes for the 2 of them to die, as mercilessly as those they had murdered in Silver Spring, Maryland.
I tried to call Christine early the next morning, but she was still screening her calls and wouldn't pick up. She'd never done that to me, and it stung. I couldn't get it out of my head as I showered and dressed. Finally, I went to work. Sampson and I were out on the streets before 9. The more I read and thought about the Citibank robbery in Silver Spring, the more troubled and confused I was about the exact sequence of events. It didn't make sense. 3 innocent people had been murdered. For what reason? The bank robbers already had their money. What kind of cruel and twisted sickos were they? It turned out to be a long and consistently frustrating day. Sampson and I were still on the job at 9 that night. I tried calling Christine at home again. She still wasn't picking up. Or maybe she wasn't there. I have a couple of tattered black notebooks filled with names of street contacts. Sampson and I had already talked to more than 24 of the prime ones. That still left plenty for tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. I was pretty well hooked into the case already. "We're dancing around something," Sampson said, as we drove through Southeast in my old car. The late, great Marvin Gaye was singing on the car radio. I thought of Christine. She didn't want me out here on these streets anymore. She was serious about it. I wasn't sure if I could quit being a detective. I liked my job. Sampson asked, "Who's going to talk to us?" "How about that ugly mutt there?" I said, and pointed toward the street corner we were approaching. "He knows everything happening around here." "He spotted us," Sampson said. "Shit, there he goes." I spun the steering wheel hard to my left. The Porsche skidded toward a stop, then hopped the curb with a jolting thud. Sampson and I jumped out and started to run after Cedric Montgomery. "Stop, police!" I yelled at him. We shot down a narrow, twisted alley behind the small-time enforcer and all-around tough guy. Montgomery looked back and couldn't believe we were right behind him. We both hit him at the same time. He went down like a shocked wide receiver, crushed between 2 very fast linebackers. Montgomery rolled a few times, moaned, and then looked at us in total amazement. 2 hours later, Montgomery was talking to us at the station house on 3rd Street. He admitted that he had heard something about the robbery and murders over in Silver Spring. He was willing to trade information if we would look past 6 dime bags he had in his possession when we gang-tackled him on the street. "I know who you're looking for," Montgomery said, and he seemed sure of himself. "But you ain't gonna like hearing who it is." He was right. I didn't like what he told me. Not at all. I wasn't sure whether I could trust Cedric Montgomery's information, but he'd given me a good hard lead that I had to follow. He was right about one thing. His tip was disturbing to me. One of the people he'd implicated in the robbery was the stepbrother of my late wife, Maria. He'd heard that Errol Parker might have done the bank in Silver Spring. Sampson and I spent the next day trying to locate Errol, but he wasn't at home or at any of his usual haunts around Southeast. His wife, Brienne, wasn't around either. No one had seen the Parkers for at least a week. Around 5:30, I stopped by the Sojourner Truth School to see if Christine was still there. I'd been thinking about her all day. She hadn't answered my calls or returned any messages. I had met Christine Johnson 2 years before, and we'd almost gotten married. Then a sad and tragic thing happened, and I still blamed myself. She was kidnapped by a monster who had committed several murders in Southeast. She had been held as a hostage for nearly a year. Christine was kidnapped because she was seeing me. She was missing for a year and believed to be dead. When Christine was found, there was another surprise. She had a baby, our son Alex. But the abduction had changed her, wounded her in ways she didn't understand, and she couldn't cope with that. I tried to help in any way I could. It had been months since we'd been intimate. She kept pushing me further and further away. Now, Kyle Craig had made it even worse. Nana usually watched over the baby while Christine was working at the Sojourner Truth School. Then Christine and little Alex went to her apartment in Mitchellville. It was the way she needed it to be. I walked inside the school through a side metal door near the gym and heard the familiar sound of basketballs pounding against hardwood and the laughter and joyful screams of kids. I found Christine huddled over the computer in her office. She is the principal at the Sojourner Truth School. Jenny and Damon are students there. "Alex," Christine said when she saw me at the door, "I'm almost finished for the day. Just give me another minute or two." When she was ready to go, we locked up the school together, then strolled down School Street toward 5th. I carried Christine's briefcase filled with what felt like a dozen books. "Actually, I'm kind of glad you came by tonight," she said. Couldn't keep myself away. "I want to talk to you about something, Alex," she said. She stared into my eyes. I could tell from the look on her face that this probably wasn't good news I was about to hear. "I was hoping it wouldn't bother me. You're getting on a new murder case? But it does bother me, Alex. It makes me crazy. I worry about you. I worry about the baby. I worry about my own safety. I can't help it after what happened in Bermuda. I haven't been sleeping since I returned to Washington." It tore me apart to hear Christine talk like this. I felt terrible about what had happened to her. She changed so much. There didn't seem to be anything I could do to make it better, to help her. "I remember some of the dreams I've had lately. They're so violent, Alex, and they're so real. The other night, you were chasing the weasel again, and he killed you. He stood there calmly and shot you again and again, and then he came and killed the baby and me. I woke up screaming." I took her hand. "Jeffrey Schaefer is dead, Christine," I said. "You don't know that, not for sure," Christine argued, and pulled her hand away from me. "Alex, I have to tell you something else. I've been going to a psychiatrist, Dr. Belair, in Mitchellville. He's helping me." Christine continued to stare into my eyes. "I don't want to see you anymore, Alex. I've thought about this for weeks. I've talked about it with Dr. Belair. You can't change my mind, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't try." She took her briefcase from me. Then she walked away. She didn't let me say a word, but I would have found it hard to speak anyway. I had seen the truth in her eyes. She didn't love me anymore. What made it so much worse was that I still loved her. So I threw myself into the bank robbery and multiple murders for the next couple of days. The newspapers and TV were still filled with sensationalistic stories about the murdered father, child, and nanny. The picture of 3-year-old Tommy Buccieri seemed to be everywhere. Did the killer want us to feel outrage? I wondered. Sampson and I spent most of the next day trying to find Errol and Breon Parker. The more I followed up on the Parkers with the FBI, the clearer it got that they had probably been robbing small banks in Maryland and Virginia for at least a year. The job at Silver Spring was different. If they had done it, something had happened to change their style. They had become brutal, heartless killers. Why? Sampson and I stopped for lunch at a Boston market around 1 in the afternoon. "You think the Parkers are off doing another job?" he asked me, as we dug into orders of meatloaf, corn, and mashed potatoes. "If they're the ones who did the bank in Maryland, They're probably hiding out. They know the heat is on. Errol sneaks off to South Carolina sometimes. He's a fisherman. Kyle already has FBI agents on the ground there. You ever spend time with Errol? Sampson wanted to know. Family get-togethers mostly, but he only came to a few that I can remember. I went fishing with him once. He was like a little kid, as long as we were catching largemouth bass or 2 or 3 pound catfish. Maria always liked Errol. Sampson kept eating his meatloaf. You think about Maria much? I scrunched down into my seat. I wasn't sure I wanted to talk about this now. Different things remind me of her, especially Sundays. We'd sleep until noon sometimes, treat ourselves to a nice brunch, or visit the duck pond near the river. It's a sad, confusing thing, John, that she died so young. It especially hurts that I could never solve her murder. Sampson kept hounding me with questions. You and Christine doing all right? No, I admitted, but I couldn't quite get out the whole truth. She can't get over what happened with Jeffrey Schaefer. I'm not even sure the weasel is dead. We finished here? Sampson grinned. Food or my cross-examination? Let's go. Let's find Errol and Breon Parker, solve the bank robbery, and take the rest of the day off. Around 7 o'clock, Sampson and I decided to take a dinner break. We figured we'd be working late, probably past midnight. I went home for supper with the kids and Nana Mama. Sampson and I agreed to meet around 10 to check out a few night crawlers who would be easier to find after darkness fell. At 10:15, we were trolling southeast again in my car. Sampson spotted a small-time drug hustler and snitch we knew. Darryl Snow was hanging out with his boys in front of a bar and grill that kept changing its name and now was called Used to Be's. Sampson and I hopped out of the Porsche and came up fast on Snow. He had nowhere to run. As always, Darryl was a drug hustler fashion plate. Crimson nylon shorts over blue nylon pants, polo t-shirt, Tommy Hilfiger windbreaker, Oakley shades. Hey there, Snowman, Sampson said in his deep voice. You're melting away to nothing. Even Snow's hustler friends laughed. Darryl was around 5'11", and I doubt he weighed 120 pounds, with his clothes on. Walk and talk with me, Darryl, I told him. This is not open to discussion. His head shook like a dashboard doll's, but he reluctantly went along. I don't want to talk to you, Cross. Errol and Breon Parker, I said, once we were far enough away from the others. Darryl looked at me and frowned heavily. His head continued to bob. You're the one married to his sister, whatever. Why are you asking me? Errol doesn't spend a lot of time with his family anymore. He's too busy robbing banks. Where is he, Darryl? Sampson and I don't owe you any favors right now. That's a dicey place to be. Snow sniffled and cursed under his breath. I heard Breon may be over the old First Avenue projects. Ratchet buildings on First? I don't know if she's still at that place, though. That's all I got. He held out his hands, palms up. I hate this nasty, eerie middle-of-the-night shit, Sampson said, as we approached the First Avenue project on foot. What we saw up ahead were abandoned tenement buildings where junkies and homeless people lived, if you could call it living. Errol Parker? Breon Parker? I said in a low voice, as I walked past badly strung-out men with hollowed, unshaven faces. Nobody answered. Most of them wouldn't even look at me, or Sampson. They knew we were police. We began to walk through each of the buildings, floor by floor, basement to roof. The final building we came to looked deserted, and for good reason. It was the most squalid and broken down. I had the flashlight, so I led the way. As we'd done in the other buildings, we started in the cellar. I came to a closed wooden door, and I pushed it open with my foot. I could hear rodents of various sizes scurrying around inside the walls. I waved my flashlight around. Nothing but a couple of glaring rats. Sampson and I continued the floor-by-floor search. The building was damp and smelled of urine, feces, mildew. I shoved open another door, and knew by the putrescence that we'd found dead bodies. I waved the flashlight and saw Breon and Errol. They no longer looked human. The building was warm and decomposition began faster. I calculated they'd been dead for at least a day, probably more. I shined the flashlight at Errol first.